When we imagine medieval life, we often picture banquet halls and roaring fires, but for the average peasant, winter brought no such luxury. It was a season of hardship, where each night could become a fight for survival. Their homes were not stone fortresses, but small huts made from mud, straw, sticks, and dung. These crude shelters offered little resistance against the cold. Walls cracked in the frost. Roofs sagged under snow. Windows, if they existed at all, were tiny holes stuffed with rags or animal skins. Wind seeped through every gap, and the dirt floors turned to icy mud. Inside, a central hearth offered the only source of warmth, a small, smoky fire pit without a chimney. The smoke filled the room, stinging eyes and lungs, but it also helped drive away insects and added a sliver of warmth. Yet the air inside was often barely warmer than the air outside. Clothing was rough and limited. Most peasants owned just a few layers: wool tunics, threadbare cloaks, and rags wrapped around their feet. Beds were sacks of straw, often shared, infested with fleas and placed directly on the frozen ground. For children and elders, even waking up in the morning was a victory. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. To understand how medieval peasants endured the cold, one must begin with their homes. Structures not built for comfort, but for necessity. These dwellings, typically constructed by the families who lived in them, were made from the most accessible materials: wattle and daub. A frame of woven sticks was packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung, forming walls that were thin, fragile, and highly permeable to wind and water. The roofs were usually thatched, bundles of dried reeds or straw tied together and laid over wooden beams. While thatch could be remarkably insulating when carefully maintained, most peasant homes suffered from sagging rooftops riddled with gaps and leaks. In heavy snow or rain, it wasn't uncommon for water to drip steadily onto sleeping faces, or for entire patches of roof to collapse under the weight of winter storms. Windows were a rare luxury. If a home had any, they were small slits in the wall, often covered with wooden shutters, animal hides, or even oiled parchment to let in light while keeping out the worst of the wind. But most relied on simple openings, which were often left uncovered to allow smoke from the hearth to escape, at the cost of inviting the bitter cold back in. The floors, almost always bare earth, were a source of constant discomfort. In dry months, they turned to dust. In wet months, they became muddy, slippery, and bitterly cold. Straw or rushes were spread across the ground to form a barrier, but they quickly flattened underfoot, turned moldy, and attracted fleas, lice, and rodents. To fight back against these miserable conditions, peasants developed an array of small, clever techniques. Moss, cloth scraps, and tufts of animal hair were crammed into wall cracks to block drafts. Extra layers of daub were slapped onto exposed patches, especially before the coldest months. Roofs were patched with reeds, rags, or sod to slow leaks. Even doors and shutters, crude wooden planks, often warped by damp, were sealed with whatever could be found: fat-soaked cloths, strips of leather, or bundles of grass tied together and stuffed into the gaps. Peasants understood their homes were in a constant state of battle with nature, and maintenance was not a luxury, it was a survival tactic. Repairs were never-ending. After every storm or snowfall, families walked the perimeter of their huts, checking for fresh cracks, sags, or gaps where the cold had crept in. Tools were basic: wooden mallets, spades, and hands chapped raw from the wind. But the will to endure drove the work. Some even experimented with layering the interior walls with woven mats or hanging cloths made from old tunics to create a rudimentary insulation. Though it did little to raise the temperature, it helped block the drafts and made the darkness feel less exposed. Every inch mattered when warmth was a precious commodity. It wasn't just about protecting themselves. Livestock, goats, pigs, chickens, were often kept under the same roof. Their body heat added a few degrees to the room and offered a kind of living insulation. But their presence also introduced new problems: odor, waste, and chaos. Still, for a peasant family, warmth outweighed cleanliness. These homes, crude as they were, reveal a striking truth about medieval resilience. Though the architecture was primitive and the resources meager, ingenuity filled the gaps that stone and mortar could not. Every clump of moss, every handful of dung mixed into the walls was a quiet act of resistance. Proof that survival was not a matter of luck, but of relentless effort. If the wind and walls were one enemy, the earth beneath the peasants' feet was another. In winter, the ground turned into an unrelenting source of cold, pulling heat from the body with a quiet, constant grip. Inside the average peasant hut, there were no wooden floors, no stone slabs, just packed dirt, worn smooth by generations of footsteps and work. But in winter, this surface became a slow, invisible threat. Cold rose up from the ground like breathless fog. It crept through straw, through cloth, through skin. Lying directly on it was unthinkable, unless necessity demanded it. And often it did. To fight this, peasants covered the floor with rushes or straw. In some regions, these were changed seasonally. In others, they accumulated over months, mingling with spilled food, ash, animal waste, and human filth. The resulting layers were not just dirty, they were alive with fleas, lice, and sometimes mold. But replacing them meant hauling in sacks of fresh material, something not every household could afford to spare during the leanest months. Cleanliness gave way to insulation. Beds themselves were humble affairs. Some families used wooden frames raised a few inches off the floor, strung with rope or leather strips to support straw-filled mattresses. Others, especially the poorest, made do with bundles of hay laid directly on the ground. These straw beds were crude and lumpy, often damp from the surrounding moisture and prone to rot. But even this thin layer was vital, anything to place even a few centimeters between the body and the freezing earth. For those lucky enough to have animal skins or coarse wool blankets, the layering was strategic. Blankets were placed between the straw and sleeper, not just above, to trap any rising warmth. In the absence of real insulation, heat had to be borrowed from the body and held as long as possible. Even a poorly tanned sheepskin could mean the difference between a cold night and a deadly one. Sleeping close to the fire was another tactic. Many huts were single-room structures, and families arranged themselves accordingly. The youngest and oldest, those most vulnerable to the cold, were positioned closer to the hearth, where the warmth could still be felt. The healthier adults formed a barrier on the outer edges, shielding them from the drafts. It was not about comfort, it was triage by temperature. Peasants also adapted their sleep behavior. They curled tightly to preserve heat, arms drawn in, feet tucked. Some kept small stones near the hearth during the day and placed them under bedding at night, wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. Others simply relied on the heat of shared bodies, children, parents, even livestock, pressing together like coals in a dying fire. Yet despite every precaution, the risk never vanished. Waking up numb, shaking, or blue-lipped was common. Sometimes limbs were lost to frostbite without warning. For those too young, too old, or too ill to maintain body heat through the night, sleep could quietly become their final breath. The cold ground did not roar like a storm or howl like the wind. It did not strike like fire or flood. Instead, it waited, silent and patient, beneath every step and beneath every bed, turning the very earth into an enemy. But peasants, ever resourceful, learned how to hold the line, with straw, with skin, with fire and grit. And so, they endured. In the center of every medieval peasant home stood the hearth. Not a fireplace in the modern sense, but a simple fire pit, dug into the earth or built up with stones and clay. It was small, smoky, and temperamental, but it was also everything. In winter, the hearth was the house's beating heart, its only true defense against the encroaching cold. More than a place to cook, the hearth was a source of light, warmth, and life. Its fire kept frost from creeping too close. Its glow allowed families to work, eat, and care for one another during the long, dark evenings. For homes without windows, or with only crude slits in the wall, the fire was often the only illumination available once the sun fell. But it was an imperfect tool. With no chimney, smoke from the fire drifted upward and lingered under the roof, curling into eyes, mouths, and lungs. The air was thick and acrid. Children coughed, eyes watered. Yet no one complained, not really. The smoke meant the fire was alive. And its side effects were, in their own way, useful. Pests like fleas and lice hated the smoke, and its constant presence helped dry damp clothing or bedding hanging nearby. Keeping that fire alive was a daily, nightly struggle. Wood was scarce and valuable. Peasants rarely had access to thick, dry logs. Instead, they relied on twigs, small branches, peat, and even dried animal dung. Everything that could burn was gathered, stored, and rationed. Even children spent hours each week scouring fields and forest edges for kindling. Letting the fire go out wasn't just inconvenient, it could be deadly. On the coldest nights, rekindling a flame from scratch meant waiting in the dark, shivering and numb, for enough heat to cook or warm a space. It also meant losing precious embers, which were difficult to recreate without flint, tinder, and skill. In many villages, if one home's fire went out, neighbors would share coals, sometimes carrying glowing embers wrapped in moss or tucked inside clay pots. To stretch the life of a fire overnight, peasants practiced fire banking, a simple but essential technique. As night fell, the fire's coals were buried under a thick layer of ash, cutting off oxygen while preserving heat. In the morning, the ashes were gently brushed aside, revealing glowing embers that could be coaxed back into flame with fresh fuel. It wasn't foolproof. If the ash layer was too thin, the fire would burn out. Too thick, and it could smother completely. But when done right, it meant survival. The hearth also functioned as a social core. After the day's work, field labor, food preparation, mending clothes, families gathered around it. Meals were cooked in pots suspended over the flames or nestled into the embers. Bread was baked on stones at the edge of the fire. Children huddled close, clutching bowls of hot porridge, while elders told stories or said prayers. In that flickering light, bonds were reinforced and lessons passed down. Even animals were drawn near. In homes that shared space with livestock, the warmth of the fire was as essential to the animals as it was to the humans. Pigs snorted, chickens rustled, and goats chewed quietly in the shadows, adding their own warmth and noise to the night. In every sense, the hearth was life. It demanded care, vigilance, and respect. It smoked, it coughed, it sometimes refused to light. But when it burned, it held back death. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the wind battered the walls and the cold crept near, it was the fire's soft glow that reminded peasants they were still alive. For medieval peasants, the fire was more than warmth. It was survival. And in the dead of winter, keeping that fire alive overnight was a delicate art passed down from parent to child. This practice was known as fire banking, the technique of preserving embers through the night so the hearth could be easily revived come morning. It was simple in concept, but the margin for error could mean the difference between life and death. In households where wood was scarce, and it often was, banking the fire allowed families to conserve precious fuel. At the end of the evening, once cooking and heating were done, glowing coals were carefully raked together at the center of the hearth. Over them, a thick layer of fine ash was gently sifted. The ash insulated the embers, shielding them from wind and limiting the oxygen flow just enough to prevent the fire from burning out completely. The process had to be done with precision. Too little ash and the fire would continue to burn, consuming all the coals. Too much, and the embers could suffocate entirely. Peasants knew the texture of ash like they knew the soil of their fields. Its dryness, its weight, how it responded to wind and moisture. In homes where this knowledge was lost or neglected, fire had to be rebuilt from scratch the next morning, an exhausting and sometimes impossible task during severe weather. To restart the fire, the ashes were gently pushed aside at dawn. If the technique had worked, a dull red glow would pulse beneath. Carefully dried twigs and bits of straw were added, blown on with soft, rhythmic breaths until flames reappeared. If nothing glowed, if only cold gray powder remained, it meant failure. The house would remain frigid, the morning meal delayed or skipped, and someone, usually a child, would be sent through the snow to borrow embers from a neighbor. This task, carrying embers, was treated with both urgency and care. A glowing coal might be placed in a carved-out turnip, in a clay pot, or wrapped in damp moss inside a wooden box. Too much air and it would flare up and die. Too little and it would suffocate. There was no time for play or distraction during the errand. Lives depended on that tiny ember staying alive. Because fire banking was so vital, families often rotated watch over the hearth. In larger households, someone would wake in the night to check the coals, adjust the ash, or add a stick of wood. Even small children were taught to recognize the smell of dying fire or the color of heatless ash long before they could read or write. But this process wasn't without risk. On stormy nights, strong gusts of wind could blow through cracks in the walls, scattering ash and exposing embers to sudden air, causing flare-ups or smothering them entirely. In shared homes where livestock slept nearby, a startled goat or pig could stumble into the hearth, disrupting the carefully banked fire, even starting a blaze. The fire was never truly tame. It was a companion and a threat, a blessing and a burden. Still, the practice endured. Fire banking wasn't just a technique, it was a nightly ritual, a quiet act of vigilance and an echo of ancient knowledge. Every household had its version, adjusted for hearth shape, wood type, or region. It connected generations, tying grandmothers to grandsons, and kept families alive through the longest, blackest nights of winter. In a world without matches, lighters, or thermostats, keeping the embers burning was both a science and a sacred duty. And for medieval peasants, mastering this fragile balance was one more way they fought, night after night, not just for warmth, but for life itself. When the cold grew deepest and the fire flickered low, medieval peasants turned to their oldest, most reliable source of warmth: each other. In a world without central heating, thermal insulation, or thick woolen duvets, communal sleeping became not a choice, but a necessity. It was the human body, more than any building material or garment, that offered the most dependable protection against winter's chill. Inside peasant huts, sleeping arrangements were rarely private. Families often lived in single-room homes where cooking, eating, working, and sleeping all occurred in the same space. On cold nights, beds were shared not by couples but by entire households. Parents, children, grandparents, and even neighbors, all pressed close on piles of straw or tattered sacks filled with rushes. They formed what modern historians sometimes call human lasagna, layers of bodies packed together facing inward, legs and arms intertwined, trying to hold warmth between them. The healthiest and strongest were positioned on the outside, forming a human barrier against the cold air. The frailest, the infants, the elderly, the sick, were nestled at the center, protected by the living walls of their family. The discomfort was real. Beds were scratchy, often damp, and infested with fleas or lice. Personal space did not exist. People shifted and coughed. Elbows jabbed ribs. Children wet themselves in the night. Yet no one expected rest to be easy. Survival, not sleep, was the goal. Peasants knew instinctively what modern science would later confirm: that shared body heat can raise ambient temperature significantly. Even livestock, with their thick hides and steady warmth, were sometimes included. Pigs curled at the foot of beds, chickens perched near heads, and goats slept nearby, adding their warmth to the mix. even if it meant enduring the occasional kick or manure pile. Hygiene was rarely a concern. Blankets were few and rarely washed. Clothing worn during the day doubled as nightwear. Woolen tunics, sheepskin wraps, and head coverings to trap precious warmth. The scent of sweat, smoke, and livestock hung thick in the air, but no one noticed. Everyone smelled the same. In winter, the line between human and home blurred. You didn't live inside a shelter, you became part of the warmth machine it created. Communal sleeping also served a deeper function. It fostered resilience. Children were raised not just in close physical quarters, but in shared suffering. They learned from their elders how to conserve heat, how to recognize signs of hypothermia, and how to shift quietly in the night without waking others. These were not just bedtime habits, they were generational survival skills. In the darkest hours, conversation sometimes continued. Parents whispered stories, prayers, or old songs. The sharing of heat was matched by the sharing of memory. Oral traditions were passed down here, in the stillness between firelight and frost. At times, even community extended beyond the household. A neighbor whose fire had failed or who had lost a family member might be invited in. There was no question of space. It was understood that warmth and life were communal responsibilities. A few extra bodies meant a warmer night for all. These nights were not pleasant, but they were effective. Huddled in scratchy garments and crumbling huts, peasants used the simplest of technologies, their own bodies, to shield themselves from the unforgiving cold. It was intimacy born not of affection, but of necessity. In their stubborn refusal to surrender to the frost, they demonstrated a quiet, enduring brilliance. That sometimes the best defense against a brutal world is simply one another. In the harshest weeks of winter, medieval peasants turned to a most unexpected ally in their fight against the cold: their animals. Far from being kept in barns or separate enclosures, livestock were often brought directly into the living space, turning the peasant home into a chaotic, smelly, but crucially warmer haven. These animals, raised for food, milk, or labor, became vital members of the household, not just for survival through the seasons, but for surviving each night. Cows, pigs, goats, and chickens were not strangers to the home. In fact, in many peasant dwellings, there was no true separation between the animal and human quarters. A low wooden barrier, a few stones, or sometimes nothing at all, marked the space where livestock slept, ate, and defecated alongside the family. In some huts, the floor was slightly sloped to allow animal waste to drain away, or more realistically, pool in a designated corner. The primary reason for this shared space was simple: body heat. A single adult cow could generate as much warmth as a small fire. Pigs, compact and warm-blooded, radiated heat in all directions. Goats and sheep, though smaller, were numerous, and their collective warmth could noticeably raise the ambient temperature of a room. Chickens, often overlooked, tucked under benches or clucked quietly near the hearth, adding just a bit more warmth to the air. The effect was tangible. On especially cold nights, having animals inside could mean the difference between freezing breath and tolerable chill. Families curled up in straw beds while animals snorted and shifted beside them, their breath forming small clouds in the darkness. The shared warmth wasn't pleasant, but it worked. There were, of course, costs. The stench was overwhelming. The air, already thick with smoke from the hearth and the dampness of packed bodies, now carried the scent of manure, wet fur, and old hay. Cleanliness was an afterthought. Fleas and lice didn't discriminate between species, and many nights were spent scratching at invisible itches. The sounds, too, were disruptive. Hooves scraping wood, chickens fluttering in their sleep, pigs rooting around for scraps. Yet no one complained. Complaining didn't make a space warmer. There was also danger. In cramped quarters, a startled cow might kick. A frightened goat might bolt through a doorway, letting in freezing air. Chickens pecked at toes. Children tripped over sleeping pigs in the dark. But none of these risks outweighed the simple benefit of survival. Bringing livestock indoors also served a protective function. In times of scarcity, animals were a family's greatest wealth. Losing a cow to theft or wolves could mean hunger, not just that season, but for years to come. Keeping them inside served as both shelter and security. Over time, peasants developed rhythms around their animal companions. In the evenings, after feeding the fire and arranging the bedding, animals were led inside. Hay was spread. Doors were sealed. The night began with the rustle of feathers and the soft grunts of pigs settling in beside human breath. The air was foul, the floor damp, and the space tight, but it was a system honed by centuries of necessity. And in the morning, when the frost clung to the outside world and the cold bit at every unwrapped finger, it was often the slow rise of steam from a cow's back or the soft warmth of a goat nestled nearby that reminded the family. They had made it through another night. In the grand tale of human survival, livestock were not just beasts of burden or sources of food, they were companions in the cold. Their warmth was a silent, living gift, and without them, many would not have survived the long medieval winter. In a medieval peasant's winter arsenal, after fire and flesh, came fabric. Clothing, though rough and scarce, was one of the few barriers between the human body and the icy grasp of the outside world. But unlike modern winter gear with waterproof linings, synthetic insulation, and tailored seams, peasant garments were humble, homespun, itchy, and often threadbare. Still, these layers, when arranged with care and cunning, became armor against the cold. Most peasants owned only a few garments. A basic outfit for winter included a coarse wool tunic, a cloak or mantle, woolen leggings or hose, and perhaps a second tunic underneath if they were fortunate. Undergarments, usually linen, were a luxury, and many went without. Instead, they relied on strategic layering, piling on everything they owned, regardless of comfort or mobility. Tunic over tunic, cloak over shoulders, rags wrapped tightly around arms and legs. It was not about elegance, it was about survival. Wool was the material of choice. Coarse and heavy, it retained heat even when damp and could be woven at home or purchased secondhand from market stalls. Peasants wore it year-round, but in winter its weight became a blessing. Cloaks, often cut in semicircles, could be pulled tightly around the body like a cocoon. If lined with old fur, they offered even more warmth. Though most linings came from sheepskin, rarely luxurious furs like fox or squirrel, which were reserved for the upper class. Footwear was another challenge. Boots were rare. Most peasants wore wooden clogs or simple leather shoes, often passed down through generations until they nearly fell apart. In winter, they lined them with rags, hay, or moss, stuffing every gap to keep toes from going numb. Still, frostbite was common, especially among children. Socks, if they existed, were made of wool or wrapped cloth, held together with leather straps. Hands were protected in similar fashion. Gloves were uncommon, but peasants wrapped their hands in strips of cloth or wore sleeves so long they could be folded over the fingers. Hats, however, were essential. Heat loss through the head was well known, even if the science behind it wasn't. Woolen caps, hoods, or coifs were pulled low over the brow. Children often wore hand-me-downs so large they drooped over their eyes, but no one minded as long as it kept the warmth in. And then there was the dirt. In modern times, filth is seen as a sign of poverty or neglect. But for medieval peasants, dirt was insulation. Clothes were rarely washed in winter, water was too cold, and garments too precious to risk shrinking or damaging. Over time, layers of sweat, grease, ash, and earth built up in the fibers, sealing gaps and stiffening fabric into wind-resistant shells. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it worked. A cloak soaked with months of grime could block a sharp wind better than a clean one. This medieval Gore-Tex, as some historians jokingly call it, may not have smelled pleasant, but it was effective. It also had the added benefit of deterring lice and pests who disliked the acidic buildup on wool. And since everyone smelled the same, no one felt self-conscious. Warmth mattered more than appearance. Layering was a daily ritual. Before bed, families often slept fully clothed, wrapping themselves in cloaks, head coverings, and even shoes. The idea of undressing to sleep was unthinkable in the depths of January. In some homes, outer garments were hung near the hearth to warm slightly before being thrown back on in the morning. In the end, the peasant's wardrobe was not fashionable or even fully functional, but it was adaptive. Every layer, every scrap of cloth, every grimy tunic represented one more line of defense against the cold. And in a world where heat was precious and fire uncertain, clothing wasn't about self-expression. It was survival, woven one rough thread at a time. In the frigid heart of winter, when wind clawed through the gaps in every wall and frost painted the inside of peasant homes, survival meant using every tool available, even those that modern sensibilities might find repulsive. Chief among these unlikely tools was dirt. To the medieval peasant, filth was not just a consequence of poverty, it was a shield. In a world without washing machines, indoor plumbing, or soap in any regular supply, dirt and grease built up naturally. But over time, peasants came to understand, even if only intuitively, that this grime had protective qualities. What began as necessity became strategy. Clothing was rarely, if ever, washed during winter. The process was too dangerous. Washing meant removing garments, getting wet, and waiting for them to dry. Tasks nearly impossible in freezing temperatures. Clean clothes might be fresh for a moment, but they lost the crusty, dense insulation that came from months of wear. The layers of accumulated oils, sweat, and ash made wool stiffer, more wind-resistant, and surprisingly warm. This protective coating turned tunics into makeshift armor. It sealed tiny holes in the fabric, preventing icy gusts from reaching the skin. The stench might have been pungent, but so was the air outside, sharp with cold and smoke, and most people were too preoccupied with staying alive to care. The idea of bathing in winter was similarly shunned. Water, when not frozen, was chilling to the bone. It was widely believed that bathing opened the pores, making the body more vulnerable to cold, illness, or worse. And in the age before germ theory, peasants relied on what they could observe. The dirtiest people often seemed to survive the longest winters. The clean, ironically, were sometimes the first to fall sick. Church doctrine occasionally reinforced this mindset. While spiritual cleanliness was paramount, physical cleanliness was often framed as vanity or even sinful indulgence. Monks and clergy might bathe ceremonially, but the peasants' reality was far grimmer. In some regions, peasants joked that they bathed twice a year, once at midsummer, once before Christmas, if at all. Dirt wasn't only about clothing or skin. Household surfaces were likewise layered in soot and ash. Walls near the hearth blackened with smoke. The floor, covered with straw and rushes, slowly compacted into a matted, damp cushion of organic debris. It was filthy, it was unsanitary, but it also insulated. Cold air rising from the earth was softened by the thick, dirty barrier. Peasants walked on filth, but it spared their bones from the deeper chill of bare ground. Children, crawling through straw and mud, grew up hardened to it. Parents taught them not to wipe grime away, but to pack it tighter. Between gaps in walls, around the edges of windows, under blankets. Hair became greasy and clumped, but in doing so, it trapped warmth and discouraged lice from nesting in exposed scalps. Grease from cooking pots was even rubbed into leather boots or mittens to make them more water-resistant. In every corner of the home, dirt was used deliberately. A layer of ash in the privy to control odor, a smear of mud to seal a window crack, soot smeared on a wooden beam to keep insects away. This was not laziness. It was adaptation. Modern observers might recoil from such filth, but for the medieval peasant, it was simply life. Dirt was a tool like fire, straw, and stone. It stood between warmth and hypothermia, between sleep and death. And in the end, what mattered wasn't how you smelled, but whether you lived to see spring. When night fell and the fire dimmed to a dull red glow, medieval peasants retreated to their beds, not for comfort, but for protection. Sleep was a necessity, not a luxury, and the bedding that cradled their bodies through the coldest hours of winter was as humble as the huts they lived in. Rustic, makeshift, and barely adequate, these beds were built not to soothe, but to shield. The average peasant bed was no more than a rough wooden frame, if one existed at all, strung with ropes, reeds, or leather strips. On this, a mattress of sorts was laid, a sack stuffed with straw, hay, or dried rushes, often tied shut with bits of string or fabric. The fill was lumpy, uneven, and rarely replaced. In time, it flattened, grew musty, and attracted lice, fleas, and even mice. Still, it provided a barrier between the sleeper and the cold ground, and that was what mattered most. In poorer homes, even the frame was absent. Families slept directly on the floor with straw piled beneath them and old cloaks or sheepskins above. The straw might be spread loosely or tucked into worn fabric sacks, whatever could be managed. It was itchy, it was noisy. It smelled of animals and mold, but it insulated. Replacing bedding was not done lightly. Clean straw required time, labor, and resources. Hay was food for animals. Rushes had to be gathered from marshes. Many households put off changing their beds for months, layering new straw over old until the weight and smell became too much. In some cases, bedding was burned and replaced entirely at the end of winter, a rare act of cleansing that marked both survival and the start of a new season. Blankets, as we think of them today, were rare. Most peasants slept in their clothes, wrapping themselves in cloaks, mantles, or spare garments. Sheepskins were prized, thick, heavy, and naturally insulating. They could trap body heat better than woven wool. Families often shared what coverings they had, pulling cloaks over multiple bodies huddled close together. There was no such thing as your blanket or your side of the bed. Bedding arrangements followed practical logic. Children and the elderly were placed near the center of shared sleeping areas, where their fragile bodies could benefit most from collective heat. Adults flanked them, forming a barrier against drafts. In homes with animals, pigs or goats might nest nearby, their warmth adding to the household's own. Even the position of sleep was strategic. People curled tightly, arms tucked, knees drawn to the chest. A posture that conserved warmth and reduced exposed surface area. Side sleeping was preferred. Back sleeping left the body open to cold air, while stomach sleeping risked inhaling cold from the ground. Bedding was not only functional, it was deeply social. Nighttime brought families together literally and figuratively. In the dark, under shared coverings, they whispered stories, sang low songs, or murmured prayers. It was in the rustle of straw and the heat of another's breath that children learned family histories, saints' names, and survival wisdom passed down through generations. Despite its flaws, its bugs, its dampness, its coarseness, rustic bedding was a peasant's refuge. It was the place they returned to after hours in frozen fields or long shifts tending fires. It cradled their bones, bore their weight, and, if only barely, softened the world around them. It would be easy for modern eyes to see these beds as miserable, unfit for rest. But to those who depended on them, they were islands of warmth in a sea of cold. And for every child who awoke to the scent of smoke and the muffled stirrings of animals, it meant another morning had arrived. One more day survived. In the medieval countryside, where the wind whipped freely across fields and through forests, the greatest enemy often wasn't the blizzard or snow, but the draft. Invisible yet relentless, cold air found every crack, gap, and weakness in a peasant's home. And in huts made of wattle and daub, woven sticks packed with mud and straw, those weaknesses were everywhere. Unlike stone castles or timber-framed manors, peasant homes were not designed for insulation. The walls cracked in dry weather and crumbled in wet. Roofs sagged. Doors shrank. Windows were rarely more than slits or holes. As winter deepened, the wind slipped through every seam like a silent invader, draining warmth with each icy breath. To fight this, peasants employed constant creative patchwork. Sealing drafts was not a single act, but a seasonal ritual, one that began in late autumn and lasted all winter long. Every family member had a role. Children were sent to gather moss or scraps of cloth. Mothers soaked rags in animal fat to make wind-blocking seals. Fathers packed fresh layers of dung and mud onto walls already thick with last year's repairs. Moss was especially prized. Its sponge-like texture could be pushed into wall gaps, door frames, and window edges. Cloth was crammed into holes where larger repairs weren't possible. Animal hair, straw, feathers, nothing was wasted. The goal was simple: plug every opening that let the wind in and the warmth out. Wall repairs were made using the same materials the homes were built with. Fresh daub, a blend of mud, straw, water, and dung, was slapped onto thin areas, smoothed with hands or wooden paddles, and left to dry. The smell lingered, but no one minded. It hardened like plaster and provided a temporary barrier against both cold and pests. Roofs were a particular challenge. Thatched with straw or reeds, they leaked after heavy snow or rain. Peasants patched them with whatever they had: bundles of rushes, turf, even old cloaks. Cloth soaked in tallow was wedged under leaking beams. Some families piled turf or sod over the thatch, adding weight and insulation, even if it risked collapse during storms. Doors and windows, when they existed, were points of vulnerability. Hinges were simple wooden pegs or loops of leather which swelled or shrank with the weather. Doors rarely shut tight. To seal them, peasants hung hides or woven mats over the entrances, pinning them down with stones or rods. Windows were covered with animal skins, sometimes smeared with fat to block wind and moisture. In colder regions, families made fat-soaked cloth panels, primitive but effective insulation, hung like curtains to trap warmth inside and stop airflow. Around the hearth, where walls were often weakest, extra layers of mud and even flat stones were added to keep the fire's warmth from leaking out into the night. These measures were not glamorous, and they required constant upkeep. A rainstorm might undo hours of sealing. A strong gust could rip loose a patch of moss. Animals bumped into fragile barriers. Children tripped over wind blocks in the dark. Yet the work continued, every day, every night. This relentless maintenance was an act of will. It spoke of a people who understood their environment intimately, who noticed the subtle shift in wind direction, the sudden whistle through a familiar wall, the dampness that hinted at a new leak. They responded with resourcefulness, repetition, and resolve. In sealing their homes, medieval peasants were not simply repairing buildings. They were fighting for control in a world dominated by cold, using only what nature and their own hands could provide. Their huts may have been crude, but each moss-stuffed crack and dung-patched wall was a line drawn between life and the deadly chill just outside. As the bitter cold of winter gripped the medieval countryside, warmth inside peasant homes became a fragile and temporary comfort. A single ember gone dark, a gust of wind through an unsealed wall, or the failure to tend the hearth, properly could mean a night of freezing misery, or worse. To combat this ever-present danger, many peasant families adopted a strategy that defied the natural rhythm of sleep. They slept in shifts. In homes where resources were scarce and the fire burned small, maintaining heat was a communal responsibility. No one person could keep the hearth alive through the night without interruption. Firewood, twigs, and peat were precious and often burned too quickly to last till dawn. If left unattended for even an hour, a flame might wither to ash, and with it, the household's only line of defense against the deadly cold. And so sleep became fragmented. Instead of all resting at once, families divided the night among themselves. While some lay curled beneath cloaks and straw, others remained half awake by the hearth, eyes watching the fire, hands ready to feed it the next bit of fuel. These guardians rotated throughout the night, trading places in the darkness, whispering quietly as one body rose and another settled in the warmth they left behind. Children, even as young as 6 or 7, were taught the importance of this system. They might not carry the heaviest logs, but they could gently stir embers, retrieve twigs from the side of the room, or prod a peat brick back into position. It was a form of apprenticeship, learning not only how to keep a fire alive, but why it mattered. The elderly, often excused from labor in the fields, sometimes took the first shift of the night, sitting near the hearth wrapped in woolen shawls, nodding off and waking again with each pop of the fire. Parents traded off silently, tending both children and flame. In larger households, older siblings might take turns watching the hearth, while the others slept in a tangle of limbs on the straw mat behind them. Even the method of fire tending was cautious and deliberate. Peasants knew the fire's behavior intimately, how it shifted with the wind, how it dimmed when starved of air, how a single spark could catch on a stray bit of thatch or cloth. The sleeping fire tender kept water or a damp cloth nearby in case the flames jumped beyond the hearth's edge. But the greater fear was silence, the stillness that came when no crackle could be heard and no heat could be felt. Outside, the world remained indifferent. Winds howled through the trees, snow gathered on sagging rooftops. Wolves, their breath steaming, wandered the edges of villages. But inside, as one body stirred and another fell asleep, a different kind of rhythm pulsed, the quiet, vigilant rotation of survival. This shift-based sleeping wasn't just practical, it was also psychological armor. Knowing that someone was awake brought comfort in the darkness. Children slept more soundly knowing their mother or grandfather sat nearby, feeding the fire, guarding the warmth. For adults, staying awake, even while exhausted, meant retaining a measure of control in a season that robbed so many of agency. On particularly stormy nights when snow battered the walls and the fire hissed under wind, the sleeping shifts became even more urgent. Some families shortened the intervals, switching every hour. Others paired up, one to tend the hearth, the other to keep them awake. It was not restful, but it was necessary. In the chronicles of peasant life, there are no songs about sleeping in shifts. No ballads honor the one who stayed awake while the others dreamed. Yet these unsung routines, night after night, held the darkness at bay. For without the watchers, there would be no fire. And without the fire, there would be no morning. Among the many silent battles medieval peasants fought to survive the cold, few were as subtle or as instinctive as the way they breathed. To modern ears, breathing may seem an automatic, unthinking act. But in a world without thermal insulation or modern medicine, even breath itself could become a matter of life and death. For peasants, especially during the deepest freezes of winter, learning how to breathe in the cold was part of the larger art of survival. On bitter nights, when the wind slipped through moss-stuffed cracks and the fire faded to coals, every inhale was a risk. Drawing in cold air too quickly, especially through the mouth, could trigger sharp chest pain, coughing fits, and, in the worst cases, illness. The danger of pneumonia or lung inflammation was ever present, particularly in the elderly or those already weakened by malnutrition or exhaustion. To avoid this, peasants practiced shallow nasal breathing, a method passed down not through formal teaching, but through shared experience and quiet correction. Breathe through your nose, a mother might whisper to her child as they settled into a straw bed. Close your mouth, tuck in your chin. These lessons were repeated nightly, especially in the coldest weeks when even the inside of a home was only marginally warmer than the world outside. Breathing through the nose served multiple purposes. The narrow nasal passages warmed the air slightly before it reached the lungs, reducing the shock of the cold. The slower pace of nasal breathing also conserved body heat and prevented the rapid loss of warmth through open-mouthed exhalation. It was a quiet, simple defense, but remarkably effective. To support this, peasants used makeshift breath warmers. A strip of cloth, wool, or an old rag, often smelling of smoke, tallow, and earth, was tied around the lower face, covering the mouth and nose. Some used sleeves or the edge of a cloak. The fabric trapped the warmth of exhaled air and created a small pocket of heat in front of the face, allowing each new breath to pass through a barrier of slightly warmer air. Children were taught to sleep with their heads tucked under the same shared cloak as their parents, using body heat not only for warmth but for easier breathing. In some homes, straw or sheepskins were shaped into small headrests or nests that cradled the face and allowed breath to cycle back gently into the nose, retaining warmth without suffocating. During the most frigid nights, conversation was minimal. Speaking meant opening the mouth, wasting precious heat, and risking lungfuls of cold air. Many families communicated in gestures or low murmurs, and only when necessary. Hushed environments were not just a cultural trait, they were a physiological necessity. Silence preserved heat. Even prayer was adjusted. Evening devotions or whispered invocations to saints like Saint Michael or Saint Blaise, the patron saint of throat ailments, were recited quickly and quietly. Breathing came first. Faith could warm the spirit, but it could not thaw frozen lungs. Peasants also avoided sudden breathing after exertion. Returning from the outhouse fetching firewood or coming in from a drafty corner required a pause. They would stand near the hearth, breathing slowly through the nose, cupping hands over the face and waiting for their lungs to adjust. These small rituals were part of the winter rhythm, invisible knowledge shaped by countless cold nights. Today, it's easy to overlook the sophistication in such simple acts. But in the medieval world, survival hinged not just on strength or tools, but on awareness, on the body's small negotiations with its brutal environment. Breathing in that world was more than life. It was strategy. In the harsh winter months, medieval peasants turned to one of the most reliable sources of internal warmth: food. Long before the science of thermogenesis was understood, they knew from experience that a full belly meant a warmer night. And so, even when supplies were low, families made deliberate efforts to eat hearty, heat-generating meals before crawling into their straw beds. Evening meals during winter were not elaborate. Meat was scarce, vegetables withered, and bread had to be carefully rationed. Yet peasants found ways to stretch ingredients into meals that offered both calories and comfort. The goal was not taste, it was endurance. What they sought was slow-burning fuel, something the body could metabolize through the night to generate warmth from within. Thick stews and porridges were central to this strategy. Barley, oats, or rye, cooked with water, and whatever fats or scraps were available became the peasants' thermal battery. If beans, lentils, or root vegetables had been stored properly, they were added in. Occasionally, a bit of salted pork or bone broth might be included, turning a simple pot into a small miracle of sustenance. The heat of the meal warmed hands and stomachs alike. Fat, when it could be found, was gold. A smear of lard in porridge, a few drops of tallow melted into soup. These additions were prized. Fat digested slowly, stoked the metabolic fires, and created a feeling of warmth that lingered long into the night. Parents made sure children received their share first. A child who went to bed hungry might wake coughing, cold, or worse. Not at all. Bread, though ever present in peasant diets, was often coarser and darker in winter. Made from whole grains and sometimes mixed with husks or mashed beans to stretch the flour, these loaves were dense and filling. When dipped into hot broth or laid beside a bowl of grain gruel, they became more than just food. They were insulation from the inside out. Timing was important. Evening meals were served just before bed. Peasants knew that eating and then staying active wasted the warmth food created. Instead, they huddled around the hearth, ate quietly, and then quickly settled into shared bedding to trap the warmth that digestion produced. In this way, mealtime flowed directly into sleep, and warmth was passed from bowl to belly to blanket. Children were taught early to eat slowly and thoroughly. Swallowing hot food too quickly might warm the throat but wouldn't last. Chewing well, layering bites with bits of bread or swallows of broth, was considered both polite and wise. In many homes, the act of feeding was as sacred as prayer. There were also folk beliefs tied to winter eating. Some thought that going to bed on an empty stomach allowed evil spirits or the cold itself to enter the body more easily. A full belly was considered both physical protection and spiritual shield. Parents whispered warnings about frost demons and hollow men who came for the unfed, keeping children close to the fire in their bowls. Of course, hunger was always close. In famine years or poorly planned winters, there wasn't always enough food to follow this pattern. In those cases, parents often gave up their own portions so children could eat. The gnawing cold was bad, but the gnawing of an empty stomach was worse. In some homes, a single boiled turnip or crust of bread was divided with solemn care. But when the food was there, when the pot boiled and the bread was warm, mealtime became more than nourishment. It was preparation for the cold, a quiet act of hope against the night's dark hunger. And as they lay together under cloaks and skins, peasants carried that warmth inside them, letting digestion do what fire could not. When firewood was scarce and the cold refused to relent, medieval peasants turned to ingenuity. Beyond body heat and layered clothing, they developed simple yet surprisingly effective methods to conserve warmth and stretch fuel. Among the most clever of these were hay boxes and heated stones, low-tech thermal tools that helped families survive long nights with minimal resources. The hay box was a kind of primitive slow cooker and insulator. At its most basic, it consisted of a wooden box or basket lined thickly with hay, straw, or wool scraps. A cooking pot, often made of iron or clay, was brought to a rolling boil over the hearth, then immediately transferred into the hay box, where it would continue cooking slowly, sealed in by the insulation. This method allowed peasants to conserve firewood. Instead of keeping a pot simmering over the flames for hours, they used a short burst of high heat, then let residual heat and insulation do the rest. Stews, porridges, and gruels all adapted well to this method. By dinner time, the food would be soft, warm, and ready to eat, without needing to tend the fire all day. But hay boxes weren't just for food. As winter deepened, peasants adapted the same principle to heat storage. Stones, fist-sized or larger, were placed in or near the hearth during the day, absorbing the fire's warmth. Before bed, these stones were carefully removed with tongs or wrapped in rags to prevent burns, then placed beneath bedding, in straw mattresses, or even tucked into cloaks. A well-heated stone could stay warm for hours. Positioned near the feet or against the belly, it offered comforting, localized heat through the coldest part of the night. Families sometimes shared them, passing stones between children like sacred relics. In homes with limited firewood, 1 or 2 stones might be the only source of heat once the fire was banked and left to smolder overnight. Of course, these tools were not without risk. A mishandled stone still glowing from the fire could ignite straw bedding or cause burns. Children were taught early to check the temperature with the back of their hand or wrap stones in multiple layers of cloth. Accidents did happen, especially in the dark, when bodies shifted in sleep. But the danger was considered worth the reward. Some families combined both tools. A heated stone placed at the bottom of a hay box could keep a pot warm for hours, allowing not just continued cooking, but the possibility of a warm breakfast without restarting the fire. Others used warmed clay pots, sealed with cloth or cork, to retain heat and carry embers, useful in emergencies or when traveling. The brilliance of these tools lay in their simplicity. Hay was everywhere. Stones were free. A peasant didn't need to buy or barter for them. They required no fuel, no maintenance, just a bit of knowledge and a good memory for timing. Over generations, each household developed their own tweaks. How many layers of hay to use, which stones held heat longest, which fabrics best resisted scorching. More than clever survival hacks, hay boxes and heated stones were acts of planning and foresight. They showed how peasants not only endured the winter night, but prepared for it. Thinking ahead, maximizing every ember and turning the most basic materials into tools of resilience. In a world where warmth could never be taken for granted, these objects became extensions of the hearth itself, pockets of fire carried into the dark. And when a child curled up beside one, toes pressed to warm stone beneath straw, it was not just heat they felt. It was proof that someone had thought ahead to keep them alive. As winter deepened and temperatures dropped below freezing, the fire became more than a centerpiece of the medieval peasant home. It became the axis around which every survival decision revolved. Nowhere was this more evident than in how families chose to sleep. In these single-room huts, where you laid your head at night could mean the difference between comfort and calamity. The hearth, typically located at the center or along one wall of the home, offered the only consistent source of warmth. With no chimney to vent the smoke, the fire's heat radiated outward in a narrow, fragile radius. Beyond that invisible boundary, the cold returned quickly, seeping through walls and floors, chilling the air until breath turned visible and limbs stiffened with frost. To combat this, peasants practiced strategic sleeping arrangements, organized around proximity to the fire. The most vulnerable, the infants, the elderly, and the sick, were placed closest to the hearth, where residual heat lingered even after the flames had dimmed. Parents flanked them, acting as living buffers against both the cold and accidental contact with open coals. The strongest and healthiest, usually older children or working adults, took the outermost positions, bearing the brunt of drafts from doorways and poorly sealed walls. The arrangement resembled the layers of an onion or the ripples in a pond, warmth at the center, resistance at the edge. This wasn't simply a matter of comfort, it was triage by temperature, a quiet calculation repeated every night. Care had to be taken. Getting too close to the fire presented its own dangers. Embers popped unpredictably. Firewood shifted in the night. A stray foot or elbow could land in hot ash. Families laid stones or bricks as low barriers around the hearth, or positioned large cooking pots to prevent accidental contact. Children were warned repeatedly, don't turn your back to the fire, don't kick in your sleep. Bedding was also arranged to make the most of the hearth's reach. Straw pallets or sheepskins were oriented like spokes around a wheel, all aiming toward the center. In smaller homes, the family might sleep in a semicircle, facing the hearth, noses tucked beneath cloaks, listening to the soft hiss of burning wood as both lullaby and lifeline. Even livestock had their place in this configuration. Chickens huddled near the walls, away from the heat but protected from wind. Pigs and goats, if brought indoors, curled near the fire as well, especially prized for their body warmth. They were not obstacles, but participants in the night's choreography of warmth. A cow's breath, steaming in the dim firelight, added its own layer of living heat. Every detail was deliberate. The side you slept on, facing the fire or facing away, affected how long your hands stayed warm. How many layers you wore, and whether your feet were near a warmed stone or dry wood, made a noticeable difference. Even which direction the wind blew mattered, as families sometimes shifted their entire sleeping pattern to block an incoming draft from reaching the hearthside. When the fire was banked for the night, its coals hidden beneath ash to survive until morning, sleeping near it became a matter of vigilance as much as warmth. Someone, often an elder or parent, remained semi-awake, ears tuned to the sounds of the fire. The crack of wood, the sigh of smoke, the dreaded silence of coals going cold. Yet in all this calculated positioning, there was also intimacy. The hearth, with its flickering glow, became a quiet witness to whispered prayers, shared warmth, and the rustling closeness of family life. In its light, peasants did not just survive the night. They drew close, held each other, and waited together for morning. In the depths of a medieval winter, no peasant family survived alone. Beyond the warmth of the hearth and the layering of clothing, there existed a deeper, more powerful form of insulation: community. In villages battered by wind and buried in snow, it was human connection. Neighbors helping neighbors. That kept entire settlements alive. Medieval peasants lived in tight-knit rural communities, often no more than a few dozen families clustered around a central church, mill, or manor. Their homes were close enough that smoke from one chimney could drift into another's thatch. Paths between huts were well trodden, even in snow, because isolation wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. When one fire failed, when a roof caved in, when food ran short, it was the village, not the individual, that stepped forward. Sharing warmth was a sacred obligation. If a family's hearth went cold, they could knock on a neighbor's door to borrow embers, carried in moss-lined pots or wrapped in cloth. It was common to pass glowing coals from house to house like holy relics. These were not favors to be repaid. They were lifelines exchanged without question. Children were often the messengers. Bundled in layers and clutching baskets or clay pots, they ran through snow to fetch fuel, food, or help. It was dangerous work. Paths were slippery, frostbite a constant threat. But no adult would risk leaving a warm home if a nimble child could go instead. And children raised in these rhythms understood their importance. They weren't merely helpers, they were the circulatory system of the village. Food, too, was shared. In hard winters, families who had preserved an extra jar of beans or salted pork would offer to those in deeper need. Communal storage, grain silos, smokehouses, or cellars dug into hillsides were sometimes pooled and guarded by the village collectively. In some places, informal rotations existed. A different family cooked a large pot of stew each day and shared portions with others, ensuring that no one household burned through its firewood or food too quickly. Work was communal. Repairing roofs, sealing walls, or hauling firewood through frozen fields was rarely done alone. Men banded together to patch thatch or clear collapsed paths. Women gathered in each other's homes to mend clothing or churn butter near a shared fire. Even simple tasks like drying herbs or preparing rushes for bedding became group efforts. Time passed more easily when spent together, and tasks went faster when hands multiplied. And when tragedy struck, when illness claimed a grandmother or frostbite took a child's fingers, neighbors didn't stand at a distance. They offered warmth, supplies, prayer. Grudges were shelved. Feuds were softened. In the face of winter's shared cruelty, solidarity became survival. The village's spiritual life reinforced this. The parish church, even when unheeded, was a source of unity. Candlelit vigils during cold snaps, communal prayers for the sick, and feast days brought people together not just in faith, but in warmth. The church might serve hot broth to the poorest, or allow shelter to travelers and orphans on dangerous nights. Even small gestures mattered. A neighbor might patch another's cloak without being asked, or leave dried wood outside a home too proud to ask for help. These quiet acts, exchanged under the weight of snow and silence, formed an invisible web of protection that no wall could match. In the end, winter taught peasants a truth that modern society often forgets. You cannot outlast the cold alone. Fire dies. Food spoils. Walls crumble. But a helping hand, a shared ember, a bowl of hot broth passed between rough hands, that was the warmth that endured. In the long, dark winters of the medieval world, when frost clung to windows and death felt just a breath away, peasants turned to more than fire, food, and one another. They turned to faith. For many, survival was not just a matter of endurance. It was an act of belief reinforced by prayers, rituals, and deeply rooted superstitions passed down through generations. The cold was more than a natural force. It was personalized, feared as a living threat. Peasants believed the wind carried spirits. that drafts were not just discomforts, but signs of demonic mischief or divine displeasure. In this worldview, protection from the cold meant protection from the unseen. And so, homes were not only sealed with moss and mud, but also with holy symbols and whispered incantations. Every household kept some form of religious iconography near the hearth: a wooden cross, a carved image of a saint, or a scrap of parchment with a Latin blessing might be pinned above the fire or doorframe. These were not mere decorations. They were spiritual shields meant to guard against misfortune, illness, freezing, or death during the night. Saints were regularly invoked for protection. Saint Nicholas, patron of children, was asked to watch over infants huddled near the hearth. Saint Michael, the warrior archangel, was believed to fend off dark spirits lurking in cold corners. Saint Blay, known for healing ailments of the throat and lungs, was especially cherished during winter when coughing could signal the onset of pneumonia. Before bed, families gathered to pray aloud, crossing themselves as they asked for warmth, health, and mercy. These prayers were deeply felt, recited in the low candlelight, with wind howling outside and embers hissing in reply. Some added chants or charms learned from grandmothers, phrases that blended Christian supplication with ancient folk memory. Holy water, if available, was sprinkled at doorways or around sleeping areas. Some households marked thresholds with blessed chalk, writing protective symbols or the initials of the three magi, C plus minus B, to keep malevolent forces at bay. In parts of Europe, Candlemas candles, once lit in church and blessed by priests, were carefully preserved and relit during storms, believed to ward off lightning, sickness, and death by freezing. But not all practices came from the church. Medieval peasant spirituality was a complex tapestry interwoven with superstition, folklore, and pre-Christian beliefs. Certain nights were considered cursed, times when spirits roamed freely and the veil between worlds grew thin. On these nights, families might stay awake longer, speaking softly, avoiding loud noises or laughter that could draw unwanted attention. Objects were placed strategically. A knife beneath the bed might keep away frost demons. A bundle of herbs, rosemary, juniper, or yarrow, hung above the hearth for luck and protection. Some even kept iron nails or horseshoes at windows to deflect witchcraft or the evil eye. The logic was rarely explained. It didn't need to be. It had always been done. And that was enough. Dreams, too, were interpreted carefully in winter. A dream of snow could mean death was near. A dream of fire might signal new life or an approaching thaw. Families shared dreams in the morning, discussing their meanings over bowls of broth, treating them as signs, messages from something larger than themselves. In this world of harsh elements and fragile life, faith gave structure to chaos. It offered a sense of control when control was scarce. More importantly, it gave hope. To pray was to believe that someone, something was listening, that in the endless dark there was light. So as the hearth flickered and shadows danced along cracked walls, peasants clung not only to each other but to the unseen. And in that belief, as much as in fire or straw, they found the strength to endure one more night. Despite every effort, every ember preserved, every draught sealed, every prayer whispered before sleep, not all peasants survived the winter. For many medieval families, the cold season was not just a time of hardship, it was a time of mourning. Beneath the snow-covered thatch roofs and beside the dimming hearths, loss was a silent companion. There were winters so severe that survival seemed arbitrary. Crops had failed the summer before. The stores of grain, salted meat, and dried beans had dwindled too soon. The firewood pile, once hopeful in its height, burned down before February. When the cold pressed in from every wall and the food could no longer fuel warmth, bodies began to fail. Quietly, inevitably. Children were often the first to go. Their small frames, even wrapped in layers, couldn't hold heat as long. A single night of poor breathing or a missed meal might be enough. In the morning, parents would reach for them in the shared bed and find silence, stillness, skin cold to the touch. Some mothers kept holding them, hoping the warmth of their own bodies might bring them back. The elderly followed, weakened by age, by old injuries from fieldwork, by long years of hunger. They were more vulnerable to the creeping frost. Many did not speak of their pain. Some chose to eat less, give up their spots near the hearth, or take the outermost position in the sleeping circle. It was their final contribution to the family's survival. Even among the strong, illness took its toll. Winter brought more than cold. It brought bronchitis, pneumonia, infections that lingered in the chest. With no access to proper medicine, no hospitals, and little more than herbal remedies and warm broth, many succumbed slowly. A cough that began in December might end in death by February. Entire families could be lost. During particularly brutal years, like the winter following the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, villages were found half empty come spring. Some huts stood with the doors open, fires long cold, livestock wandering free. Neighbors themselves half-starved sometimes found them weeks too late. And yet these tragedies were met with a kind of solemn acceptance. Death was not feared in the modern sense. It was a companion, expected, understood. In most villages, there were no coffins, no grave markers beyond simple stones or wooden crosses. The ground was often too frozen to dig, forcing families to store bodies in barns or caves until spring thawed the earth enough for burial. Funerals were quiet affairs. A priest, if one could be found, said prayers over the dead. If not, families offered their own, murmured Latin phrases remembered from Mass, mingled with personal blessings. The community came together, not with fanfare, but with food, help, and silence. Grief was shared, but life had to continue. And still, even in the face of such losses, peasants persevered. They returned to the hearth, banked the fire, fed the children who remained. They fixed the leaking roof, mended the torn cloak, planted the spring crop. They carried the names of the lost forward, told their stories beside the fire, folded them into lullabies. Winter in the medieval world was not simply endured. It was survived with sorrow, with resilience, and with memory. Each life lost left a scar, but each day lived was a small act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to extinguish them. They did not win every battle against the cold, but the fact that any of them lived to see another spring, that we are here to tell their story, is proof that they never stopped trying. The medieval winter did not show mercy. It tested muscle, memory, faith, and family. Yet from those bleakest nights where frost laced the eaves and breath froze midair, emerged something stronger than stone walls or roaring fires. Resilience. A legacy not written in books or etched in monuments, but passed from hand to hand, fire to fire, story to story. Peasants survived not because they were stronger, but because they were endlessly resourceful. They turned scraps of wool into insulation, dirt into armor, and animal warmth into living fuel. With no science to guide them, they crafted strategies from instinct and observation. They slept in circles, breathed with care, ate with intention. Every routine, no matter how small, banking the fire, sealing a crack with moss, pressing a heated stone into straw, was a calculated defiance against the season's cruelty. Their homes were fragile, but their knowledge was solid. In these low huts, wisdom passed quietly between generations. How to keep an ember alive, how to make one loaf stretch for days, how to listen for the silence of a dying fire. Children learned it not in school, but by watching, by doing, by surviving. Yet their resilience was not built in isolation. They endured together. In sharing food, warmth, tools, and grief, they created a communal strength far greater than any single hearth. Neighbors became lifelines. Traditions, half sacred, half superstition, stitched people into a shared rhythm of survival. Even in loss, they looked after one another, lifting bodies when necessary, lifting spirits always. Faith added its own fire, whether in Latin prayers or whispered folk blessings, in saints hung beside the hearth or chalk markings on the door. Belief brought warmth that no wool or wood could offer. It reminded them that their suffering had meaning, that their struggle was seen. And though their world seems far behind us, the echoes remain. The way we gather in times of crisis, the comfort we find in shared meals, the wisdom embedded in old customs and household habits. They carry the fingerprints of those who came before, who built endurance from nothing and handed it forward. Next time you pull a blanket close, sip a bowl of hot stew, or feel grateful for central heating, take a moment to remember them, the nameless millions who didn't have those comforts, but who survived anyway, through cold, through hunger, through darkness, with nothing but each other and the stubborn will to see the sun rise. If you've followed this journey through their long, bitter winter, I hope it's given you a deeper appreciation for what survival once meant. If you found this story meaningful, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly value the kind of stories that bring the past to life and honor the resilience of ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives. Thank you for staying through the cold.